I want to talk a bit about pre-screening and what we did and what happened in terms of how that's going to impact what we're going to be doing for the next phases of June area. Back at the beginning of March, we pushed out about 2,600 tracts between the pre-populated segments, the problem segments, the non-ag segments, which required confirmation, and then we had these segments where it was 100% non-response in 2019, and we needed to verify that the people who were still there. We had about 2,400 forms of those 2,600 that were entered into CAPI where at least the first screening question was asked. That very first question that says, do you operate inside the red lines? Yes or no. But in terms of how many got to the end of, how many were actually screened as non-ag, it was only about 120. So there was a lot of folks that maybe didn't get through as much of the pre-screening that we would have expected, or there's a lot more ag out there than was expected. There were some segments that we were told were eligible for pre-screening that, for example, if a tract operator had a comment on the record that said they were no longer in the segment, maybe that they were out of business, maybe they were deceased. Those particular tracts were actually handled by office staff. I took Ohio records, Jamie took Indiana records, Lisa Jones took the Michigan records. We went through them and we coded them up. We said, all right, well, are they really in business, or is this an old comment, or let's try to clarify this. And if they were no longer in the segment, we went in and actually coded them in CAPI and said, do you operate inside the red lines? No, so that they are already coded in there as no longer being in the segment. And if we saw in the comments, and we even made some phone calls, is there a new enumerator? We added that new enumerator to the listings so that we could get them on the mailing list for the mailing that's going out to the operators here in the next week or two. We also either entered notes into the CAPI system. Sometimes I entered comments right into the screener form. Sometimes we entered comments into the attempted contact list. But in all cases, with those particular operations, you're going to see inside the segment envelope a purple comment sheet with all sorts of notes written on it that will explain what happens. On the outside of the envelope, the label that says this is the segment number and the supervisor and the enumerator, it's going to say PS-LSF on it. That's going to be the clue that there's a purple sheet on the inside. Now, why did we have office staff do this instead of enumerator staff? Partly for money reasons, because there were actually maybe only 129 tracts that needed updating, but they were across 100 segments. And as it was, we didn't really have enough money allocated to do what pre-screening we had. So we thought at this point it would be easier to just handle those in-house so that we could make sure they were getting taken care of. The other reason why we insisted on doing it ourselves is that we had seen, as we were reviewing the comments, that there were several people that had been telling us for several years that they were out of business. And there was even one person who has been deceased since 2016. So we said, we've got to get this person off of the area frame. And why we're still contacting them after this many years, saying that they still operate a farm on June 1 of 19 when they've been dead since 2016, doesn't make sense. So we just said, we're going to take care of this in-house to make sure that those get, when they go out to the field, we're going to make sure that they get right, that the person who's deceased is not getting mailed a parcel map asking where they operate, and the people who really are operating it are going to get that map in hand. The other things that we screened in-house were what I call the non-ag segments that do not have human operators. Those are going to be your inner city neighborhoods where basically you had, it was either all listed non-ag residential and there was no names on it, or you had state forest, state park, Lake Michigan, things that don't have any agriculture in them, didn't even have a name or a person to call. We said there's no point in driving out to these places. We're just going to go ahead and get this submitted and get it done. So we just kept those in-house. For those of you, like, I'm not going to list any names here in particular because this is being recorded to be posted. So I'm not going to highlight particular segments, but some of you who've been working these surveys long enough know that we have these, several large segments that have no agriculture, no hope for agriculture, yet they still come back at us. We just took care of those in-house, and those are not going to be going out. As I said, there were only 120 that were pushed through pre-screening that were coded as non-ag tracts that were verified and or submitted as non-ag tracts, which seems really low given the number of names that we had pushed out there. The ag tracts, there were a bunch of ag tracts that were verified. They said, yes, they are growing crops, cutting hay, or there were several that were coded as don't know, which was okay because we couldn't validate who the ag tract operator was. And if you code it as don't know, that's basically just going to get them sent a parcel map. And so that when we call them, they'll at least have a map in hand that we can work with them on. Our experience during pre-screening pretty much said that the hardest people to work with were the ones who did not at least get a map in the mail, so they weren't even aware that what we were trying to do here. We have several tracts where the tract operator was coded as no longer being in the segment, which is fine, but there are several cases, well, some cases where that was done incorrectly. And I'm confident it was done incorrectly because I got some calls at the end of the pre-screening period where people said, okay, I've got this tract operator. He doesn't do anything. He's got here, he doesn't operate. And the very first question when you entered into CAPI is, do you operate inside the red lines? And so many enumerators were thinking, he doesn't operate there, he just lives there. So they clicked no on that first screen and it took them out of the segment. So then I would get the call asking, there's no place for me to enter this guy's address and phone number. I tell him he's not operating, so now what do I do? And again, reminding folks, you have to screen in if somebody is a non-ag resident in the segment. We have to screen them in as yes, they are operating inside the segment, and then answer no to all the 8 screening questions. Do you grow crops? Do you have anything in storage? Do you sell products? Do you have horses? Do you have hogs? Do you have fruits? All those questions need to be answered no before we can get them screened as a non-ag tract operator. Now, there were about 200 tracts that weren't touched at all. There were about 50 tracts where somebody added and said, I've got a new tract operator, but didn't get all the way to the end of the screener form before either refreshing their listings or logging out. So they added it, maybe they just put in the name and then got out, did not actually screen the form. When that happened, those tracts got lost. So I had some people like, I put in tracts I and J, and now they're gone, and it's making me start up with K. And that's what happens if you don't screen it all the way through. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And we had some people that submitted the segment level record early, that people said, all right, well, I've got 7 tracts here. This looks like it's okay. I've got my people, and they would just hit submit. And you might have even gotten a warning saying, hey, you don't have all your acres in yet. And they still submitted. And that will create a few problems, but we'll need to work through some of those. So we use the results of the pre-screening to determine who is going to get another copy of the parcel map. The people who are getting new maps, if they were not pre-screened, it's going to be everybody who was an ag tract operator in 2019 is going to get mailed a map. With some exceptions, if we saw, like on those purple sheets, if it says this person's deceased, so we took them out of the listing, they're not getting a map. And if we have, it says a human non-ag tract with a good address. So if we have a person that was listed, maybe it's non-ag residential, they still got a letter and they will get the copy of the parcel map and the FSA map. so that they will have those in hand when we can start calling them on May 21st. For those segments that were eligible for pre-screening, not only did they get a parcel map in March, they're going to get a second copy of that parcel map here in the middle of May. So anybody that was screened in during pre-screening where you said, do you grow crops, cut hay, are you doing anything agricultural in nature? If you said yes, or you said don't know, they are coded right now as ag, and they will also, even if they're a new segment, they created labeled ag track questionnaires for those operators. So as long as you got your pre-screening work in before April 19th, those folks are going to have labeled white questionnaires. So you're not going to have to fill in blank questionnaires for those. You'll still get some blanks because obviously there'll be people that weren't screened in right, or there's going to be unanticipated changes. But if we knew they were agricultural, we created a labeled paper questionnaire for them. Also, if the tract was eligible for pre-screening, but it never got screened, then it got lumped into the mail file as well. And that includes the non-ag tracts. So some of you were complaining that I heard, it's like, oh, wait, I know this guy's non-ag, but it says ag in the thing. It was not, it's going to leave that it was a farm until you go in to screen them out as being non-ag. So all those tracts, if they weren't touched, even if they're non-ag, if they're farms, they're going to, or if they're not, even if they're not farms, it thinks that they're going to be a farm, so it put them into the mailing list to make sure that they could get them. The only ones that were screened out, well, we'll get to that on the next slide. You're going to see in your listings in CAPI, one of the columns, and you don't normally look at this, there's something called DCMS, which is a data collection method strategy code. If we have a code that says 220 or 620, they're getting a map in hand. So who didn't get a map? In the segments that were not pre-screened, if the tract operator is not a human, so it's if it just says like commercial buildings, waterways, ditches, woods, or 220 homes, then if there was nobody to mail it to, then we did not put them on the mailing list. Also, if we did not have a good address to mail it to, then we didn't. We had some cases where we might have had a name, it just didn't have any place we could send it, then that was not put in the mailing list. Now, for segments that were eligible for pre-screening, if they were pre-screened and it was validated that this is not a farm, this is non-ag, and you got all the way to the end of the screen, even if you didn't submit it, if you got to the screen that says, this tract qualifies as a non-ag tract, do you want to submit or do you want to screen another tract? If it got that far, then it was taken out of the mailing list. And again, if it was what I call non-human, non-ag tracts, again, that's what I was saying before. It's woods, it's water, it's ditches, it's commercial buildings. Or if you coded an operator as being no longer in the segment. If they're no longer in the segment, then they were taken out of the mailing list. And what you're going to see in those in CAPI, and I'll have a screenshot of what the CAPI listing will look like later, the DCMS code is going to be 400, that they didn't get anything at all. Now, where this is going to be somewhat confusing, and I've had a couple calls on this already, what's going to appear in CAPI? Everything. Your ag tracts, your non-ag tracts, even if you've already submitted them and even if you've already coded them as no longer in the segment, everything is going to be in your CAPI listing, because ultimately everything has to be accounted for in terms of getting the acres that are ag versus non-ag versus who's not in the segment. So I did not say, well, this guy's an office hold, we don't want to call this guy. Well, fine, we don't want to call this guy. I still have to submit something because we still have to estimate or code up the tract questionnaire for him. If it has a good address or it has a bad address, if it has a good phone, it has a bad phone, good respondents, chronic refusals, anything that was previously submitted and it's available to, you're looking at it and saying, why would I do this? I already took care of this guy. I need to have everything open so that we can account for the entire segment when you go to submit that as one package. If we didn't include those, the CAPI instrument will get messed up because it will think, hey, there's 7 tracts that I'm expecting, but I only see 3 in the listing. It needs to have all 7, even if the other 4 you've already taken care of. CAPI expectations for ag tracts. So what do we need to make sure is done to get the ag tract data in there? First, again and foremost, make sure we're collecting the data on paper first. We need to make sure it's right on paper before trying to go straight into CAPI. First thing, of course, on the screener form, make sure you say yes. Do you operate inside the red lines? Yes. You validate the address and the contact information. You answer yes to at least one of the screening questions, that they grow crops, cut hay, raise livestock, etc. You're going to get that orange banner that says that it qualifies as an ag tract. Then you can submit the screener, start the survey, complete the ag tract questionnaire in CAPI. And if you don't have a complete report, we need to make sure that the minimum data requirements are entered in there, which are generally making sure that you've got all the names, the partners, the type of operation it is, and the Section D material. And we'll talk about that in a sec. And then submit the ag tract in CAPI. For an ag tract, the minimum data requirements in CAPI are very much like the minimum data requirements expected for the paper form. We need the name and address of the tract operator. You need the 9921 box filled in, which says, is this an individual? Is this a partnership? Is this a managed operation? If there are partner names and addresses, we need those entered and verified. And we need a complete Section D. We need the total tract acres and how those acres were utilized, even if that comes through observation. We don't want to submit a Section D with 0 acres on it. If we get a blank Section D coming through on this end, it creates all sorts of problems on the back end. And then we're going to have to push them back out to the field and then have something get re-entered in there so that we can get those completed. You will also not be able to submit the segment if you have a Section D that is completely blank. It won't let you. Observations to help with sections E and F, livestock present in the tract if you can observe it, and then of course the office use boxes, whether it's the response code if it was refusal inaccessible or complete, the respondent code, the mode code, numerator ID, and the date. For non-ag tracts, the CAPI expectations for the non-ag tracts, of course, first we have to say yes to that initial screener question that says, do you operate inside the red lines? But also think, do you live inside the red lines? I'm going to put in a request to see if we can have that changed for next year so that it's clear, okay, people think operate, they think farm. So they don't necessarily think about living there. We want to avoid that confusion, but realistically, do you operate inside the red lines or do you live inside the red lines? You can say yes to that question. You complete the screener form in CAPI through validating the address and contact information. If they are non-ag, you'll answer no to the 8 screening questions, whether you grow crops, cut hay, livestock, horses, idle land, pasture, etc. Enter the minimum data requirements. It'll say this qualifies as a non-ag tract. They submit the screener form. Says these are the minimum data requirements. We need the name and address. We need to know the number of acres that are in the tract. We need the land use. We need the potential for agriculture. Is it, will there be any potential for agriculture before June 1 of 2022? And we need to know the type of non-ag tract. Is it residential? Is it woods? Is it waste, water, government land, what have you? If you don't submit the minimum data requirements to begin with, CAPI is going to give you a warning. It'll pop up a little orange banner, but again, I'm going to talk about that later. So important items to remember here, so make sure you're doing everything on the paper form first. Only answer no to the initial screener question in CAPI if they do not operate a farm and they do not live in the segments. So essentially, if you're going to cross the name off on the paper screener because they're not there anymore, that should be the only time you should be checking no. Now, if you said no to somebody and then realize, wait, I should have said yes, you can always go back in and rescreen someone back in. The other thing to note is to say all segments must have at least one track. We need to account for all the acres, even if it's just one tract that just says woods and swamp, and make sure that that is all submitted in there so we can get that tract clean and the segment clean. And as a reminder, if you need to change the name of the operator, you may need to add a new tract letter. If all you're doing, though, in changing the name is fixing the spelling, there were a couple that I saw when I was doing mine where it said, oh, this guy is spelled Lewis, Lewis, but it should be spelled Lewis, Louis. If you have something like that where you're just changing the spelling of a name or you're inserting a middle initial, you need to put a comment in there so that they know when we're reviewing it that it's actually the same person. And then you shouldn't need to get a new ag tract in there. If you just say, well, it was Bob and now it's Dave, and you just change the name over from Bob to Dave and submit it, I'm going to get errors on my end that says this is a different person. You need a new tract. And that will cause some problems downstream. Please take a look at the comments. We are going to have people who are reluctant respondents in this sample. We don't have the option of holding them or really not mailing them because we had to have them available in CAPI to enter something for them. Pay attention to it. There will be comments about people who are operating in multiple segments. Obviously, we don't want to interview somebody 2 times or 3 times if they are in 2 segments or 3 segments. We can do one interview that can couple everything together. If you have somebody that's in 2 segments, but it's split between 2 enumerators, one for each segment, make sure they're coordinating with each other as to who is going to do the interview for that one track, for those 2 tracks across the 2 segments. There may be comments about partners that need to get added or need to get dropped that we haven't been able to do anything with since the summer of 2019 because they won't let us change partners except if it's June. So this is the time to fix those. We may have some old comments that are no longer relevant and may need updating. And again, if you see the purple sheet, it's going to provide all sorts of notes that Jamie or Lisa or I wrote all over it as to what we did with that operator based on the comments that we saw. Make sure you're monitoring the CAPI listings as well. There will be some comments inside the CAPI screening forms based on ones that either you guys screened or we screened. There may be some comments in the attempted contact log that will help based on what was done during pre-screening. Some forms may have already been submitted during pre-screening and you don't need to deal with them now, but they still have to be there until the very end. Some forms have already been coded no longer in segments so that you don't need to take care of those. And then you're also going to see that there are forms that will have separate CAPI start dates. Those that are in the phase 2 that start May 21, the non-ags, the horse and pasture, the CRP people, those are going to start on May 21. And then the ag tracks with the row crops or the small grains or the hay, the livestock, the grain storage, those will have a CAPI start date of May 28. Expectations for the segment level records. So this is where you're clicking on the gray bar where you have the button that says summary. We need to make sure that all the tracts are accounted for with positive acreage. We cannot have anybody with 0 acres in the tract, 0 acres in the segment unless it says they are no longer in the segment. The tract counts in CAPI should match the tract counts on the paper screener. So if your paper screener says we should have 8 tracts, but CAPI says you should have 9, you need to figure out where the extra one came from. Your total reported acres should be within, well, you're going to get an error in CAPI if you have something that's more than 10% higher or lower. We want that to be 5%, within 5%. Do not submit the segment level record until you are done with the segment, because that is the one thing that cannot be set as save for review, and it's the one thing that cannot be unlocked. Once it's submitted, it's done. make sure that you take some time to reconcile the totals that are in the summary, but everything hopefully should be copied from the paper. So if the track counts in the CAPI summary don't match the paper, ask yourself, did we forget to code somebody as no longer in the segment? That's giving us an extra, or did we code someone in CAPI as no longer in the segment that's supposed to be a non-ag tract operator? Another thing is if was there a track that we forgot to put in there and forgot to submit? If the acres don't match, if the acres look too high or too low compared to the paper forms, was there something miskeyed? Maybe you entered something that was 100 acres that was supposed to be 10 acres. Look for tracts that were not submitted. If there's an incomplete form, then maybe the acres aren't going to be showing up properly. Look for tracts that are coded as no longer in segment that should be non-ag tracts. So if you're too low, maybe it's because, oh yeah, these woods, oh, they don't operate, and so you coded them as not being there, and now you're missing all those acres of woods. And then, of course, double check the photo. Do you have any unaccounted waste acres, any roads, waterways, public lands? Double check your gridding. Make sure that the acres look reasonable based on what's expected. And of course, if it looks like the digitized acres are wrong, then we can submit it as a problem segment, but you need to let us know sooner rather than later. So summarizing, all land must be accounted for in the segment, both agricultural and non-agricultural. All tract level records must be submitted in CAPI with the minimum data requirements met. Unless the person is out of the segment, then you don't need to submit anything. Just make sure that they are screened out as no longer in segment. The segment level records must be submitted in CAPI after everything's verified. We don't want to leave anything untouched. This is not like the ag yield survey last night where if you didn't get to something, you could just leave it and we could batch it as inaccessible. Everything has to get submitted by the end of the survey. And then lastly, and most importantly, please at least provide the minimum amount of data, even if it's refused or inaccessible.